Imagine this. You're sitting in Lisbon, looking over the Tagus River. The city feels alive. Tourists filling the trams, tech workers sipping espresso in renovated warehouses, cranes shaping a skyline that didn't exist a decade ago. But here's the twist. Behind the postcards, behind the Instagram-perfect streets, you're running a country that almost collapsed under its own debt just a few years ago. A country that had to be rescued by international lenders. A country where unemployment once crossed 17%, where young people fled in the hundreds of thousands, and entire generations questioned whether they had a future at home. Now you have a choice. Do you double down on austerity and survive? Or gamble on reinvention and risk everything again? Because here's the paradox no one expected. How did one of Europe's weakest economies become one of its most surprising comeback stories? Why did investors who once fled Portugal start calling it a hidden gem? And the real question, the uncomfortable one, is this recovery actually stable or just a beautifully designed illusion built on tourism, cheap labor, and foreign money? Stay with me, because what happened next in Portugal is not just economic history, it's a warning. To understand Portugal's economic story, you have to rewind before the crisis, back to a time when everything looked stable on the surface. In the early 2000s, Portugal was riding the wave of European integration. It had joined the euro in 1999, gaining access to cheap credit and financial credibility. Money flowed in, infrastructure expanded, shopping centers multiplied, public spending increased. On paper, it looked like progress, but underneath, something dangerous was forming. Portugal's productivity remained low compared to European neighbors. Industries were not scaling, exports were weak, and instead of fixing structural problems, the country leaned heavily on borrowing. By 2007, public and private debt were quietly ballooning. Banks were exposed, households were over-leveraged, and yet no alarm bells were loud enough to change course. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit like a hammer. Credit tightened, growth stalled, investors panicked, and suddenly Portugal's fragile structure began to crack. By April 2011, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Public debt climbing toward over 110% of GDP. GDP growth collapsing into recession. Unemployment rapidly rising toward double digits. Borrowing costs skyrocketing in bond markets. In April 2011, Portugal officially requested a bailout from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. The deal was massive, 78 billion euros in rescue loans, but it came with conditions that would reshape the country for a decade. Spending cuts, tax increases, wage freezes, privatizations. A word began to define the era: austerity. And here's where it gets interesting, because austerity didn't just fix Portugal, it nearly broke it first. Let's do the math. $78 billion in loans. That sounds like salvation, right? But there's always a price. The so-called Troika, the European Commission, European Central Bank, and IMF, arrived in Lisbon with a strict plan. Cut public sector wages by up to 20%, raise VAT taxes to 23%, reduce pensions, privatize state-owned companies, shrink government spending aggressively. Now imagine this hitting a country already in recession. In 2012 alone, Portugal's GDP shrank by around 4%. Businesses closed, construction halted, consumption collapsed, and unemployment? It didn't just rise, it exploded, peaking at around 17.5% in 2013, one of the highest in Western Europe. Young people were hit hardest. Entire classrooms of university graduates found themselves without jobs. Many did what any rational person would do. They left. Over 500,000 Portuguese citizens emigrated during the crisis years, many heading to France, the UK, Switzerland, and Angola. But here's the kicker. Even as the economy was bleeding, bond markets started behaving strangely. Investors began to believe Portugal might survive. Why? Because the government didn't default. It complied. But compliance came at a cost we're just beginning to understand. And in the next section, you'll see how that cost rewired the entire country. There's a term economists rarely use publicly, but everyone understands: a lost generation. In Portugal, this wasn't theoretical, it was visible. Walk through Lisbon in 2013 and you would see empty storefronts, construction sites frozen mid-project, young professionals working part-time jobs with degrees in engineering, law, and economics. Wages fell sharply, disposable income collapsed, and the housing market? It didn't crash immediately, it stalled, because nobody had money to buy anything. But here's where the irony begins. While locals were struggling, something else was happening quietly. Foreign investors started noticing Portugal. Why? Because prices were falling. Properties in Lisbon that once cost 300,000 euros dropped dramatically. Tourism numbers, however, remained stable due to Portugal's climate and safety reputation. And then came the turning point. The government introduced the Golden Visa program in 2012. Foreigners could obtain residency by investing in property. Suddenly, cash started flowing in from China, Brazil, and Russia. At the same time, tourism began rising. From around 7 million visitors in 2010, Portugal climbed towards 17 to 18 million tourists annually by the late 2010s. Let's pause. A country losing its youth was simultaneously attracting capital and visitors. Two economies forming inside one nation. One local, struggling. One global, thriving. And that imbalance would define everything that came next. Because what looks like recovery on paper is often something very different in reality.
Tourism saved Portugal and also trapped it. By the late 2010s, tourism accounted for roughly 15 to 20% of GDP when combined with related services. Lisbon became one of Europe's hottest destinations. Porto followed. The Algarve turned into a seasonal magnet. Airbnb listings exploded. Historic neighborhoods transformed into short-term rentals. Local businesses shifted from serving residents to serving visitors. And for a while, it looked like a miracle. GDP grew, employment recovered, deficit shrank. But let's ask a harder question. What happens when an economy depends heavily on something volatile, like global travel? 2020 answered that brutally. When COVID-19 hit, tourism collapsed almost overnight. Flights stopped, hotels closed, restaurants emptied. Portugal's GDP fell by around 8.4% in 2020, one of the sharpest declines in Europe. And suddenly, the miracle sector revealed its vulnerability. But here's the twist. Instead of collapsing permanently, Portugal bounced back faster than expected. Why? Because another transformation was already underway. Remote work, digital nomads, and tech investment were arriving. Lisbon was no longer just a tourist city. It was becoming a global lifestyle hub. And that changes everything. Let's fast forward. It's 2022. Lisbon is no longer just historic charm and pastel tiles. It's co-working spaces, startup accelerators, and international conferences. Tech companies begin opening offices. Venture capital flows into Portuguese startups. Why Portugal? 3 reasons. Lower costs compared to Paris or London, EU access, lifestyle appeal. But here's the catch. Wages for locals are still relatively low compared to Western Europe. So while foreign professionals earn globally competitive salaries, many locals struggle with rising living costs, especially housing. Between 2015 and 2023, property prices in Lisbon rose by over 100% in some areas. Rent followed, and the pressure built. This is where the story shifts from recovery to tension. Because when capital floods in faster than infrastructure and wages can adapt, inequality becomes structural. And Portugal was now living that reality. But the real breaking point wasn't economic growth. It was something quieter, something political. And we're about to get there. Governments eventually react to pressure, and Portugal was no exception. As housing prices surged and public frustration grew, policymakers began rolling back some of the very incentives that fueled growth. The Golden Visa program was restricted. Tax benefits for foreign residents, like the non-habitual resident regime, began facing reforms. and rent control debates returned to the center of politics. But here's the tension. Every policy shift risks slowing investment, so Portugal found itself walking a tightrope. Too open, housing crisis worsens. Too restrictive, capital leaves. Meanwhile, inflation following global shocks in the early 2020s added more pressure. Energy costs rose, interest rates increased, mortgage payments climbed, household budgets tightened. And yet, macroeconomic indicators still looked surprisingly stable. Debt ratio slowly declining from its peak, unemployment relatively controlled compared to the crisis era, tourism still strong. So which version of Portugal is real? The struggling local economy or the resilient macro success story? The answer depends on where you stand. And that contradiction leads directly into the breaking point.
Here's the moment everything comes together. Portugal never truly collapsed after 2011, but it also never fully recovered in a traditional sense. Instead, it transformed. And transformation always creates winners and losers. Winners? Real estate investors who entered early, tourism industries, tech workers earning global salaries, government finances stabilized through exports and services. Losers? Young locals priced out of housing, workers stuck in low-wage service sectors, immigrants who never returned, small businesses displaced by tourism economies. At its peak crisis, Portugal's economy was defined by survival. At its recovery peak, it was defined by adaptation. But adaptation is not resolution, it's compromise. And here's the kicker. Portugal's public debt, which once exceeded 120% of GDP, remains structurally high even after years of improvement. The country avoided collapse, but it did so by reshaping itself around external demand, tourism, foreign capital, and service exports. So the question becomes uncomfortable. Did Portugal recover its economy? Or did it repackage it for global consumption?
Now, before you sit back and think this is just Portugal's story, zoom out, because similar patterns are emerging elsewhere. Countries balancing tourism dependency, housing inflation, foreign capital inflows, aging populations, youth emigration. Spain faces similar tourism pressure. Greece shares a bailout legacy. Even cities outside Europe, like parts of Canada and New Zealand, are seeing housing distortions driven by foreign investment and remote work demand. This is the canary in the coal mine. Portugal shows what happens when a small, open economy becomes globally desirable faster than it can structurally adapt. The result is not collapse, it's distortion. And distortion is harder to fix than crisis because everyone benefits, just not equally.
So, what do we actually learn from all this? First, economies don't just recover, they reorganize. Portugal didn't return to its pre-crisis model. It built a new one around tourism, services, and foreign capital. Second, debt crises are not just financial, they are demographic. The real cost wasn't only measured in euros, but in emigration and lost potential. Third, globalization doesn't distribute benefits evenly. It concentrates opportunity in certain sectors and cities while leaving others behind. And here's the hidden pattern most people miss. When a country becomes successful in global markets, it can simultaneously become harder to live in locally. That contradiction is Portugal today, and it's spreading. So here's the final thought. If Portugal is a success story, why do so many of its young people still leave? And if it's a failure, why do investors keep arriving? Maybe the real truth is that modern economies aren't winning or losing anymore. They're splitting. And Portugal might just be one of the clearest previews of what comes next. Now, I want to hear from you. Is Portugal a model of economic recovery or a warning disguised as success? And if you want to see how another European economy followed a completely different path, you already know what to do next. Because the next story might change how you look at the entire continent.